Chapter 1. The Diagnosis and the Departure. He walked out while I was still hooked to an IV, said he couldn't handle sickness, left a note that said he needed to live honestly. 10 years of marriage ended with one line of ink. I watched his shoes disappear from the doorway holding a diagnosis that should have broken me. Stage 2 breast cancer, a husband who ran, and silence that could have killed me if I let it. But pain didn't end me. It rebuilt me. My name is Lena Marshall, and this is how I turned the day he left into the day I began to live. The smell of coffee filled our kitchen the way it always did around 7. Ryan liked his strong black and silent. I liked mine with a little vanilla, a little warmth. That morning in April felt ordinary, the kind of quiet routine you don't realize you're going to miss until it's gone. We talked about paint colors for the nursery, about a phone call from the adoption agency that was supposed to come any week now. I remember how he smiled when he said he hoped for a girl, how he kissed my cheek before leaving for work. Later that afternoon, I drove to St. Vincent's Medical Center for what was supposed to be a quick checkup. The air in the waiting room smelled like antiseptic and lemon polish. When the nurse called my name, her voice sounded far away. I don't remember the color of the walls, only the sound of the doctor clearing his throat before he said it. Stage 2. Breast cancer. The words landed softly, almost kindly, but they cracked something open in me. He kept talking about treatment plans and percentages, about how lucky it was to have found it early. Lucky. I nodded as if that word belonged anywhere in the room. Driving home felt like moving through a fog. I rehearsed how to tell Ryan. I thought maybe we'd cry together, that he'd pull me close, promise we'd fight it as a team. Instead, when I told him, he just sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the mug in his hands. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he whispered almost to himself, "I don't know if I can handle this, Lena." I thought he meant the fear, the uncertainty, the hospital visits. I didn't realize he meant me. The following weeks blurred together. Doctor visits, lab results, the word chemo printed neatly on appointment cards. Ryan threw himself into work. Late nights became normal. He said his company had landed a big project in Seattle, something that required travel. I tried to believe him. He still kissed my forehead before leaving, but it felt like a ritual without meaning, a gesture performed for memory's sake. By November, my hair had started to thin. I hid it under scarves, telling myself it was temporary. Ryan grew quieter, checking his phone more often. I caught him once staring at me like I was already gone. One night he said he needed to clear his head, that Seattle might offer perspective. I nodded, pretending not to understand that it was already over. The first chemo session hit harder than I'd imagined. I came home nauseous, exhausted, my veins aching from the IV. The house felt too big, every room echoing with his absence. He called twice that week, both conversations short and distracted. He asked how I was, but didn't wait for the answer. Then one morning in early December, I woke to silence that felt heavier than usual. The side of the closet where his clothes hung was empty. His leather shoes were gone from under the bed. On the kitchen table sat a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was his, the kind that leaned slightly to the left. I read it twice before it made sense. "I need to live honestly. I'm sorry," that was all. No name, no explanation. I dialed his number again and again until the screen blurred through tears, straight to voicemail. I left messages that started with anger and ended with pleading, then silence. After the 5th call, I stopped. I sat on the floor by the table and stayed there until the sun shifted across the tiles. By afternoon, Laura showed up. She must have heard it in my voice earlier when I said I was fine. Laura and I had met years ago when she was a nurse on the oncology floor, where I volunteered as an art instructor. She worked 12-hour shifts and still brought energy into every room she entered. She took one look at me at the half-packed suitcase by the door and understood. "He's gone, isn't he?" she said softly. I nodded. She knelt beside me, the smell of hospital soap and peppermint gum surrounding her. "You're going to get through this, Lena, you hear me? Don't let him turn your illness into an ending. Make it your beginning." That night she made soup from whatever was left in the pantry and stayed until I fell asleep. I woke to find her cleaning the kitchen, humming quietly. She told me she'd arranged for me to meet a lawyer from the hospital network, someone who could guide me through the insurance mess. Apparently, when Ryan left, he also terminated the family health plan. The next week was a blur of paperwork. The lawyer helped me apply for COBRA coverage so I wouldn't lose access to my treatment. She explained everything in practical terms, and I nodded as if listening, though my thoughts were somewhere else. She also filed the initial divorce petition. I signed where she pointed, my hand shaking slightly. 10 years of marriage reduced to signatures and legal phrases like equitable division of assets. Selling the house was easier than I expected. Ryan didn't contest anything. We split the proceeds evenly, though I left him most of the furniture. I kept a few things that mattered: my sketchbooks, my grandmother's easel, and the small ceramic cup we bought on our honeymoon in Santa Fe. The first round of chemo ended right before Christmas. Snow fell outside the hospital window, while Laura wrapped a scarf around my head and told me I looked like a warrior. I laughed, though the sound felt strange in my mouth. On the drive home, she talked about the new year, about possibilities, about finding a smaller place in Boulder where I could heal quietly. I listened but didn't commit. The idea of planning anything felt foreign. That evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table where his note had been. The space looked the same but different somehow, as if the air itself had changed texture. I pulled out one of my old sketch pads and opened to a blank page. My hand trembled as I held the pencil. For a long time, I just stared at the paper. Then slowly, almost without thinking, I began to draw. Not people or flowers like before, but lines that curved and tangled, chaotic and raw. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest. The next morning, Laura came by with coffee and a small wrapped gift. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, its first page blank. "For new beginnings," she said. I smiled for the first time in weeks. That night, after she left, I sat by the window watching the snow drift across the streetlights. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the heater and the faint ticking of the clock. I opened the notebook and wrote slowly, carefully, as if carving the words into stone. The day he left, I began learning how to exist on my own. I closed the notebook, set it beside my sketch pad, and turned off the light. For the first time since the diagnosis, the silence didn't scare me. It felt like space. It felt like mine. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 2. Falling Apart Quietly. Snow melted into gray slush along the curb by the time I handed the landlord my first rent check in Boulder. The apartment sat on the second floor of a brick building with a creaking staircase and a view of the foothills if I leaned out far enough. Laura carried in a box labeled kitchen and told me we would rearrange the cabinets later, that the mugs should be close to the sink and the tea should be visible for bad days. I told her there would be bad days, and she said there would also be good minutes and then better hours, and that was how a life came back. I slept that first night on a mattress that still smelled faintly of cardboard. Morning light spilled across the bare floorboards, and I could hear a neighbor's radio through the wall playing old soul music. I made instant oatmeal in a dented saucepan and ate it at the counter while the heat clicked on and off. The apartment was small and spare, and I felt a surprising relief at having fewer things to look after. My sketchbooks leaned against the wall. The leather notebook Laura had given me sat on the windowsill, closed and waiting. By late January, the mirror showed more scalp than hair. I watched strands gather in the shower drain, soft as thread, and pretended it surprised me each time. On a cold Tuesday afternoon, Laura arrived with 2 scarves, a set of clippers, and the kind of determined kindness that does not ask permission. She set a towel over my shoulders, and we stood together in the bathroom under the unforgiving light. I told her I was not ready. She said no one ever is. I said I was scared of what I would see. She said I would see a woman who still belonged to herself. The first buzz sounded louder than I expected. I kept my eyes on the faucet until she touched my shoulder and told me to look up. My head felt lighter and colder, my face oddly different and also more like me than before. I traced the curve of my skull with my fingertips and let out a breath I had been holding for months. Laura found lipstick in her bag and dabbed a little color on my mouth, then wrapped the softer of the 2 scarves around my head and tied it at the nape of my neck. She told me to look again. I saw a woman who had stopped waiting for permission to survive. Chemo days were their own weather pattern. The sky could be blue and the air sharp, but inside the infusion room, time settled into a different rhythm. Nurses moved with practiced calm IV pumps, hummed a television in the corner, murmured captions no one read. Laura would sit beside me with a paperback while I sketched lines that wandered and returned, letting my hand move where my mind could not. Sometimes we talked about nothing at all. Sometimes she told me stories from her unit, and I learned the small language of hospital life, the way gratitude and grief share the same chair. In February, during a follow-up appointment at University of Colorado Hospital, a social worker mentioned a support group run by a psychologist named Dr. Thomas Harris. He had lost his wife to breast cancer years earlier and now ran a weekly circle for patients and survivors. I said I was not much for groups. The social worker smiled the way people do when they know you are wrong and handed me a flyer anyway. I went the next Tuesday. The room smelled like coffee and dry erase markers. 5 women sat in a semicircle beside a window that looked over a parking lot. A tall man in a sweater introduced himself as Thomas and asked us to pick up a stone from a bowl and describe its weight. It sounded silly. Then the woman to my left spoke about how she carried her diagnosis around like a rock in her pocket, how she sometimes forgot it was there until it pressed hard against her when she sat down. When it was my turn, I heard myself say that my stone felt smooth on one side and jagged on the other, that it could rest in my palm or cut me depending on how I held it. Thomas nodded and said that sounded true. At the end of the hour, he lingered as people packed their bags. He said he had heard I taught art once a week at the hospital years ago and asked if I had ever tried using art as part of my own recovery. I told him I was drawing again, but only lines and shadows, nothing anyone would want to look at. He said the work was not for anyone else and asked if I would consider sharing simple exercises with the group next week. He spoke gently, like someone walking on new snow. I said I would think about it. On the drive home, I realized I already knew which brushes I would bring. We pushed the coffee table against the wall in my apartment and laid out supplies the following Tuesday morning. Laura came early to help me pack everything into a tote bag and to remind me to drink water, then walked me downstairs and hugged me in the hallway as if I were leaving for the first day of school. I laughed and told her not to cry in public, and she laughed and told me she would cry wherever she pleased. That afternoon in this group room, I arranged paper and watercolors and showed the others how to paint a wash that looked like rain. We talked about breath and how to move the hand before we moved the mind. One woman painted a horizon line that tilted upward and said it felt like hope. Another painted a circle and then another inside it, then another until the page looked like a target. She said she felt like she was always aiming, never arriving. I told her that looking was a kind of arrival too. When the hour ended, Thomas asked if we could meet again next week, and maybe the week after. I heard my own voice say yes without hesitation. Word of mouth traveled the way it does in hospitals. A chaplain stopped by. A dietitian peeked in. A nurse from the infusion center asked for a seat on her lunch break. Someone suggested moving to the community center down the street where there was more space and a wall of windows that faced west. In March, I signed a volunteer form at the Boulder Community Arts Center and taped a paper sign on the door that said "Brush of Life." It felt too earnest and also exactly right. The first session at the center, a young woman I had not met before hovered by the doorway with a camera dangling from her neck. She introduced herself as Chloe Nguyen, a graduate student in film and a part-time intern at the center. She said she had heard about the class from a friend and asked if she could sit in the back and observe. She promised not to be in the way. I told her we worked with quiet and that the room had its own rules, but if she could be gentle, she was welcome. Chloe came back the next week and the one after. She sat cross-legged beside the storage cabinet and sketched in a notebook while we painted, then helped wash brushes when we were done. On a Thursday in April after class, she asked if I had ever considered letting her film a short piece about the group. She said she kept hearing versions of the same sentence in the room, that making something on paper made it easier to make it through a day. She thought other people needed to hear it. I said I was not sure. I worried about privacy. I worried about turning something fragile into content. Chloe nodded and said she could blur faces, use first names, only focus on hands, color, movement. She said it could be 10 minutes, maybe less, and that the title could be Brush of Life When Art Heals. She asked me to think about it. Thomas listened quietly when I told him about her idea and then asked what exactly I was afraid of. I said I did not want to be looked at. He said maybe it was not about being looked at, maybe it was about letting someone see. We talked as a group at the next session. People surprised me. One woman said her daughter lived in another state and that she wanted her to understand what courage looked like on an ordinary Tuesday. Another said she felt braver in the room than anywhere else, and that if someone out there might feel less alone because of us, we should try. A third said she was tired of pretending that illness was something to hide. We wrote down boundaries on a sheet of paper and everyone signed it. Chloe promised to hold the rules like glass. She filmed small moments that first day, the way water moves across heavy paper, the sound of bristles dragged gently through a jar, a hand pausing above a page. She asked me to talk while I demonstrated a simple exercise to describe what it felt like to breathe in for 4 counts and breathe out for 6 while laying down a soft wash of blue. My voice shook at first, then settled. When we finished, the class clapped not for me, but for the quiet we had made together. Chloe edited at night and sent me a link on a Monday morning in May. I watched alone at my kitchen counter with the window open to the smell of rain. The film began with an empty chair and a jar of brushes. A caption read, "Brush of life when art heals." Then hands appeared. Circles became waves. Lines lifted and fell in a rhythm that sounded like breath. I spoke about how making something gave shape to fear. Others spoke about how color carried them when words failed. The last shot was the light on the wall as the sun lowered over the Front Range. I sent Chloe a message that said it was tender and true. She asked if she could upload it to the center's channel. I said yes and then turned off my phone. I did not expect anyone to watch. By Tuesday afternoon, Chloe wrote that it had been shared by a local oncology nonprofit. By Wednesday morning, there were 10,000 views and comments from strangers calling us brave. By Thursday night, the number passed 50,000, and my inbox filled with messages from people who said they had not picked up a brush since grade school and now wanted to try. I went to the grocery store and stood for a long time in front of the produce section, staring at the way the apples reflected the fluorescent light. The world looked both exactly the same and also newly mapped. A message arrived from a woman in Florida named Angela. She wrote that she had been scheduled to start chemo the following week and had been terrified to walk through the clinic doors. Then she watched the video. She said that when I showed how to breathe while laying down color, she tried it along with me on a scrap of printer paper with a child's set of paints. She wrote that for the first time since her diagnosis, she felt something other than dread. She ended with "thank you" and a picture of a small painting taped to her refrigerator. The wash was streaky, the edges rough, and it looked like the most beautiful thing I had seen all year. I wrote back and told her that fear is heavy, but the hand is strong and that both can live in the same body without canceling each other out. In June, the divorce was finalized. The clerk at the county office slid a stamped packet across a counter that smelled faintly of toner and said that copies had been mailed to both parties. The decree referenced equitable distribution and confirmed that the house had been sold and the proceeds divided. It listed my name as sole owner of the remaining bank account that held what I had kept from the sale, along with small deposits from a patient assistance grant, and the modest checks the center issued for my workshops. I walked out into the heat and sat in my car with the door open until the sun made me squint. 10 years of a life were now a file folder on the passenger seat. I put it in the glove compartment and drove to the community center. Money still felt tight. I cut coupons and learned which grocery store marked down vegetables on Tuesdays. I tutored a neighbor's daughter in drawing on Saturday mornings for a little extra cash and a lot of joy. Laura kept an eye on my labs and called when a number looked too low, then showed up with electrolyte drinks and that peppermint gum she chewed through her shifts. Thomas asked sometimes if I was sleeping, and I told him the truth that most nights I did, and some nights I did not. He told me rest returns to people who do not demand it. As summer opened, I added an evening class because the afternoon one had a wait list. The room filled with golden light around 7, and we painted shadows that changed by the minute. A man who came to pick up his wife lingered in the doorway and watched us in silence. When she was ready, they left together, and he raised a hand in a shy wave. I went home and wrote in the leather notebook about how the smallest kindnesses tilt a day toward bearable. On a warm Friday in July after class, Chloe and I locked up and walked to the corner for iced tea. She asked me what I wanted Brush of Life to become. I said I did not want to think about scale, that I wanted to keep the room honest and useful. She nodded and said that sometimes scale tries to steal honesty, but that she had a feeling we could keep both if we kept our rules. She told me the comments section had turned into a small forum of people encouraging each other. She said someone had posted a list of inexpensive supplies, and another had offered to mail brushes to those who could not afford them. A stranger in Ohio had offered to sponsor the cost of the room for a month. I felt my throat tighten and looked away at the sunset. That night, I cleaned my apartment, a ritual I had started after chemo sessions, as if neatness could undo chaos. I wiped down the counter and straightened the stack of sketchbooks. I thought about Angela in Florida and wondered if she had started treatment yet. I thought about Ryan in a city that now felt as far away as another planet. I stood in front of the mirror with my scarf off and traced the line of my eyebrow with a fingertip. I did not flinch. Laura came by on Sunday with groceries and left a bouquet of grocery store daisies on the table. We ate pasta and watched a cooking show with the volume low. At the end of the episode, she turned to me and asked if I ever thought about how strong I had become. I smiled and told her a thing I had not yet said out loud, that he left when I believed I was at my weakest, and that maybe he simply could not stand to witness the strength that followed. Laura squeezed my hand and told me to write that sentence down. I said I would, but not tonight. Tonight I would just sit in the quiet and let it be exactly what it was, a room with 2 dishes in the sink and a vase of daisies opening 1 petal at a time. If this story touched you, please subscribe. And let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 3, Reclaiming Life. By spring, the daisies had long wilted, but I kept the vase anyway. The days grew warmer, and I could walk to the community center without losing my breath. My hair came back softer than before, more silver at the temples, a small reminder that survival leaves its own design. I started wearing it short, practical, easy to wash. People told me it suited me. The classes kept growing. Some weeks we had to borrow chairs from the senior yoga group next door. Chloe still filmed everything, quietly moving around the room with her camera catching laughter and silence in equal measure. She had started a YouTube series called Behind Her Colors, short clips of our sessions mixed with moments from her interviews. The comment sections turned into letters, women writing to each other from different states, strangers exchanging stories of remission, relapse, and small daily victories. Dr. Harris sometimes dropped by after his morning rounds. He always brought coffee and an air of calm that settled everyone. One day he stayed until the end and asked if I had considered expanding the classes beyond the community center. I laughed and said I barely managed to keep up with what we already had. He smiled and said growth is not always expansion, sometimes it is recognition. That recognition came sooner than I expected. In May, the University of Colorado Hospital invited me to speak at their annual conference, Art and Healing 2021. The invitation email sat unread for a full day because I thought it must have been sent to the wrong person. When I finally told Laura, she clapped her hands and said it was about time. "You have to do it," she said, helping me fold laundry on my couch. "I am not a public speaker," I said. "You survived cancer, Lena. You can survive a microphone." She had a point. On the morning of the conference, I wore a navy dress that Laura had insisted on buying for me. The hospital auditorium was larger than any space I had stood in since the diagnosis. My hands trembled slightly as I waited backstage. Dr. Harris was there as a moderator, and when he passed me a bottle of water, he said quietly, "You are not performing. You are sharing what already belongs to you." When my name was announced, I walked to the podium, the light warm on my face. I spoke about the first lines I drew after Ryan left, about how the act of creating had tethered me to life when nothing else could. I talked about brush of life, the laughter, the mess of colors that always looked like hope, even when it wasn't. The audience was silent, but it wasn't the silence of disinterest. It was the silence of listening. Afterward, people came up to thank me. A nurse told me she planned to start a small art group in her oncology ward. A man said his wife had been too afraid to pick up a brush again, and now he thought she might try. Among the crowd was a woman with kind eyes and silver hair, dressed in a charcoal suit. She waited until the others drifted away, then introduced herself. "I'm Evelyn Hart," she said, shaking my hand. "I run communications for the Hope Bridge Foundation." That was one of the most honest talks I've heard in years. I thanked her, unsure what else to say. She continued before I could think of a polite exit. "Hope Bridge is sponsoring a summer wellness program at the Denver Art Museum," she said. "We feature projects that show resilience through creativity. I'd like to propose we collaborate on a small exhibit of your students' work. Maybe even yours if you're comfortable." The words exhibit and museum sounded too large, too foreign. I tried to find a graceful way to decline. "I appreciate it, but I'm not sure I'm ready for something public," I said. She smiled gently. "You already are. You just proved it on that stage." She handed me her card and told me to think about it. That night I called Dr. Harris. "I met someone named Evelyn Hart," I said. "She wants to host an exhibition. It feels like too much." He chuckled softly. "Lena, you built something out of nothing. Maybe it's time to let the world see it." "I don't want it to be about me." "Then make it about what healed you. That's what people will see." Laura, of course, took his side when I told her. She came over with takeout and declared that hiding behind humility was just another form of fear. I told her I'd think about it. A week later, I met Evelyn again, this time at her office downtown. She showed me a proposal draft titled Brush of Life, A Visual Journey of Healing. She spoke about how the exhibition could inspire donors to fund similar therapy programs. She said the museum would handle logistics, the foundation would cover costs, and I would curate the art. She asked if I could create one new piece for the centerpiece, something that represented transformation. I went home that evening and stared at a blank canvas for hours. Transformation. The word felt too neat, too complete. I wanted to capture the in-between, the space where you are both broken and rebuilding. I began sketching a chair by a window, empty sunlight cutting through dust. I didn't know why that image stayed with me, but it did. By August, preparation for the show consumed every weekend. Chloe filmed the process for her series. She asked questions as I painted. "Why an empty chair?" she asked once, adjusting her tripod. "Because sometimes the absence of someone is what lets the light in," I said, not looking up from the canvas. She went quiet, then whispered, "That's the title, isn't it? The Empty Chair." I nodded. In September, Dr. Harris and Evelyn suggested formalizing our work as a nonprofit. The idea seemed impossible, but Evelyn said she'd handle the paperwork if we could form a small board. She smiled and said I was officially the president whether I liked it or not. Dr. Harris became the clinical advisor, and Evelyn took charge of communications. We filed for 501c3 status under the name the Marshall Foundation. After my grandmother, who taught me to paint, though part of me knew the name also anchored something else. When approval came back as pending, we celebrated anyway. Laura brought cupcakes to the studio and declared that it was good luck to toast before the ink dried. The weeks leading up to the exhibition blurred into late nights and last-minute revisions. The museum hall smelled of fresh paint and sawdust as workers adjusted lights and mounted frames. I chose 20 pieces, a mix of student work and my own. Each painting held its own small miracle, a landscape built from fingerprints, a portrait without eyes but full of expression, a watercolor of rain that refused to stop at the edge of the paper. Opening night arrived with the first chill of October. I wore a black dress and a silk scarf Chloe had dyed herself. The museum was brighter than I remembered. People drifted through the gallery, murmuring softly. I watched them stop in front of paintings I knew by heart, watched their expressions shift as they looked longer. Evelyn moved gracefully through the crowd, shaking hands and introducing me to donors. Laura stayed close, squeezing my arm every time someone complimented the show. At 7, Evelyn tapped a glass to signal the short program. She spoke about hope, about the partnership between art and healing, then invited me to say a few words. The microphone felt lighter than it had at the conference. I thanked the foundation, the artists, the community. Then I turned toward the largest canvas on display. "This painting," I said, "is called The Empty Chair. It reminds me that sometimes loss leaves space for something unexpected. Light, growth, peace." The applause came quietly at first, then fuller. Cameras flashed. Chloe's lens caught everything. After the speeches, guests mingled, and a man introduced himself as Daniel Cooper from the Denver Post. He had a notepad tucked under his arm in a calm manner that made it easy to talk. "I'm doing a feature on the exhibit," he said. "Your story has touched a lot of people. Can I ask one personal question?" "Go ahead," I said. "If your ex-husband were watching tonight, what would you want to say to him?" For a second, the noise of the room faded. I looked at the painting again, at the empty chair glowing under the lights. "I'd tell him thank you," I said slowly. "Because of him, I learned how to stand." Daniel nodded, scribbled something, and smiled. "That's powerful," he said before moving on. When the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, I sat on a bench facing the paintings. The space smelled faintly of varnish and champagne. Laura came over, resting a hand on my shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. I shook my head gently. "We did." Evelyn stopped by with a quick hug before heading to her car, promising to send the final donation totals. Chloe packed up her camera gear, promising to drop off the footage tomorrow. Dr. Harris lingered a moment longer, his eyes kind. "You know," he said, "most people wait their whole lives for meaning. You turned yours into color." After everyone left, I stayed for a while in the quiet, the way I used to sit in the empty apartment when silence first became my company. My phone buzzed in my bag. A message from an unknown number. I opened it without thinking. "I'm proud of you." No name, but I knew. I stared at the words until the screen dimmed, then I pressed delete and slipped the phone back into my bag. The gallery lights flickered once, before shutting down completely, leaving the empty chair glowing faintly in the moonlight through the window. I watched the light rest on the seat, and felt no bitterness, only the stillness that comes when something finally settles where it belongs. If this story touched you, please subscribe, and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 4. The Return. The following winter in Seattle began with rain that never seemed to end. Ryan sat at his desk, staring at a spreadsheet that made less sense each time he looked at it. The numbers blurred into one another, receipts piled up like fallen leaves, and the voice of his manager from the week before echoed in his head. Internal audit found discrepancies. "You need to explain these charges." He had tried. They called it a policy violation, not a crime, but the damage was done. By January, he was out of a job, and the quiet of unemployment settled over his apartment like damp air. Melissa had already moved out. She had lasted through the investigation, maybe out of guilt, maybe habit. When she left, she didn't slam the door or cry. She just said, "You're not the man I thought you were, Ryan." 2 days later, she posted a picture online of a sunrise with the caption, "Leaving behind what was never mine." He saw it while scrolling in the dark and threw his phone onto the couch, but it didn't stop the ache that crept up his spine. Weeks turned into months. His friends stopped calling, or maybe he stopped answering. He told himself he needed space to figure things out, but all he found was the hollow echo of regret. One gray afternoon, he sat at a diner nursing a coffee that had gone cold when the television above the counter caught his attention. The reporter stood in front of the Denver Art Museum speaking about a newly approved nonprofit foundation focused on art therapy for cancer patients. The camera cut to a familiar face smiling politely beside a sign that read, "The Marshall Foundation 501c3 approved." Her hair was shorter now, streaked with light brown and silver, her eyes calm in a way he didn't remember. The waitress noticed his stillness. "You okay, sir?" He blinked. "Yeah, fine. Just know someone on TV." She smiled kindly, refilled his cup, and moved on. Ryan watched until the segment ended, his reflection faint in the screen. He realized he didn't know this version of her, the one who looked unshakable. The idea that she could thrive without him made his chest tighten. By the time the check came, his decision was made. He bought a plane ticket that night. When I saw him again, it was early spring in Denver. The foundation was hosting its first charity exhibit downtown, a small event to raise funds for art therapy programs in children's hospitals. I had spent the morning arranging canvases, each painted by young patients who would later run through the gallery laughing between displays. Around noon, I sat at a table signing prints for donors. A little girl named Mia handed me a drawing of her cat wearing a cape, and I told her it was perfect. Then a familiar voice behind me said my name. "Lena." I froze. For a heartbeat, the sound didn't belong to the world I lived in anymore. I turned and saw him standing near the entrance. His hair had thinned slightly, his suit hung looser than before, and exhaustion clung to him like another layer of fabric. He looked older, but more than that, he looked uncertain, something I had never seen in him before. "Ryan," I said, my voice even. "You're here." He nodded, eyes darting around the room as if searching for a reason to be there. "I saw the news. About your foundation. I thought I should see it for myself." "You came all the way from Seattle." He gave a small, humorless smile. "There's not much keeping me there anymore." Mia tugged on my sleeve, asking if she could go see the puppet show in the next room. I told her yes, and when she ran off, I finally looked him in the eye. "What do you want, Ryan?" He hesitated. "I don't even know how to start. I've thought about this moment for months. Try honesty. It's new for you." He winced. "I deserve that." "Probably." He stepped closer but stopped short of the table. "I was wrong, Lena, about everything. I was scared and selfish. I couldn't handle watching you in pain. Every day I told myself I'd come back, but the longer I stayed away, the harder it was to face you." I studied him for a moment. His voice trembled slightly, the confidence that once filled every room now cracked and fragile. You left because you were afraid of pain, I said quietly. But pain wasn't the enemy, cowardice was. He swallowed hard. You're right. I didn't know how to stay. I didn't know how to love you through it. No one does, I said, but people with hearts learn. The silence between us was heavy but not cruel. He glanced at the art hanging behind me, small paintings of flowers and skies, and said, You made something incredible. I want to help if you'll let me. I have experience with project management fundraising. I shook my head before he could finish. This foundation exists because I learned to let go of things that no longer heal. That includes you. He looked as if I'd hit him, but he nodded slowly. I understand. I just wanted you to know I see it now. What I lost. Who I left behind. You didn't leave me behind, I said. You left yourself behind. I just stopped waiting. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. After a long moment, he whispered, I'm sorry, Lena. Truly. I looked at him, not the man who broke me, but the man broken by his own choices. I believe you, I said, and meant it. But forgiveness doesn't come with an invitation. He nodded, eyes glistening, then turned toward the exit. Before leaving, he looked back once, his hand on the door. You look strong, he said. I am, I replied. He walked out into the sunlight and disappeared into the crowd outside. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Guests came and went. Children laughed and donations filled the box near the entrance. Laura stopped by near closing, wrapping an arm around my shoulder when she saw my face. You saw him, she said softly. I did. How do you feel? Like I closed a book I didn't realize was still open. She smiled. Then it's a good day. That night after cleaning up, I drove home through the quiet streets of Denver. Spring rain tapped against the windshield and the city lights blurred into soft colors. At home, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. My inbox held dozens of messages from the event team and donors, but one subject line caught my eye. It was from a name I barely recognized at first. Melissa Young. I opened it, unsure why my hands shook. Dear Lena, you don't know me, but I once thought I did. I worked for Ryan and believed his version of everything. When he left, I told myself love meant choosing adventure, not realizing I was helping him run from guilt. We broke up months ago, and I've been trying to make sense of the pieces. I recently joined a support group for partners of cancer survivors. Yesterday, someone shared your story. I saw the interview clip where you spoke about learning to stand, and I cried through all of it. Now I think I finally understand what you must have felt. The loneliness, the betrayal, the strange freedom that follows. I wanted to say I'm sorry even if the words come late. Attached is a photo from our group's first art session. It was inspired by your foundation. Melissa. I clicked the attachment. The photo showed a small room filled with easels and laughter paint stains on the floor, and a circle of women painting together. In the center stood Melissa, hair pulled back, smiling in a way that looked honest. For a long moment I stared at the screen, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Then I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The smile that rose on my face came easily unforced. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't pity. It was peace, quiet, and complete, the kind that follows when a wound finally stops asking to be noticed. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you. Chapter 5. Proof Not Rage. Spring came early in Denver that year. The snow melted fast, and with it went the heaviness that had followed me through the last few winters. The Marshall Foundation had grown in ways I never imagined. What began as a handful of art classes now stretched across 14 states, partnering with 36 hospitals and helping more than 1,200 women rebuild through color and creation. We called the program Art for Healing. I still taught when I could, but most days I worked behind the scenes with our board, guiding a team that believed in what survival could become. Evelyn handled the big partnerships, her calm voice carrying weight in rooms full of donors. Dr. Harris oversaw the wellness curriculum, turning our small model into a national framework. Chloe ran the digital storytelling branch, her camera still following moments of light the way she once followed me. Laura continued to volunteer every month, standing by my side at workshops with her easy laughter and quiet strength. Life had not just moved on, it had taken root. In April of 2023, Evelyn called me into her office holding a letter. She handed it over with a grin. It was an invitation from NBC's Today Show. They wanted us to appear in a segment about women leading innovative recovery programs. I laughed and asked if she was sure they had the right people. She said she had already confirmed the date. A week later, we sat beneath the bright studio lights of Rockefeller Plaza. The host, friendly and polished, leaned forward and asked what inspired the phrase we often used on our foundation's website. Healing is the quietest revenge. I took a breath before answering. I used to think revenge meant proving someone wrong, I said. But when you survive something meant to break you, you realize that peace is louder than anger. Living fully is the only answer that matters. Afterward, the studio crew clapped quietly. Evelyn squeezed my hand and whispered that it was the first time she had seen me comfortable being seen. The segment aired 2 days later. Emails poured in, not about sympathy, but admiration. Women wrote that they wanted to start chapters in their own cities. A retired teacher from Michigan said she was painting for the first time in 40 years. By late 2024, our headquarters downtown had turned into a steady hum of work. The walls were covered in children's art and newspaper clippings. Daniel Cooper, the journalist from the Denver Post, dropped by one morning with a notepad and that familiar half-smile. He said he was writing a long feature on the foundation's impact and asked if I'd share more of my journey for context. I hesitated, still uneasy with attention, but he promised the story wasn't about me. It was about what I'd built. When his article ran, it was titled From Abandoned to Advocate. He described my past with careful distance, but what stood out was the ending. He wrote, "Her strength doesn't roar, it breathes." By then, Chloe was finishing her documentary. At 28, she had become a recognized filmmaker using art and empathy to tell stories about resilience. She called one night and said she was submitting Brush of Life, Her Colors of Survival to the Denver Film Festival. I told her I was proud, though the thought of seeing my own face on a screen made me nervous. She laughed and said it was not about me, it was about everyone who found themselves in those rooms. The premiere was held in March of 2025. The theater filled with survivors, doctors, volunteers, and strangers who had stumbled upon our story online. As the lights dimmed, the screen opened on a wide shot of paintbrushes soaking in water. Then came voices, not mine at first, but those of women I had taught. They spoke about fear and hope, about rediscovering color after gray months of treatment. When my voice did appear soft over a shot of sunlight through gauze curtains, I barely recognized it. It sounded steady, whole. After the credits, the audience stood and clapped. Chloe hugged me tight and whispered, "You gave me the courage to make this." I told her the truth that she had given it right back. A few months later, Evelyn told me the foundation had been nominated for a Women's Courage Award, an honor recognizing programs that empower survivors nationwide. She said I needed a new dress. Laura said I needed sleep. Dr. Harris said I needed to remember to enjoy it. The gala took place on a summer evening in 2025 at a grand hall downtown, all glass and gold light. The tables shimmered with silverware, and the stage gleamed beneath a chandelier. Grace Miller, the chair of the organization, hosted the event with grace worthy of her name. As I waited backstage, I could hear the hum of conversation beyond the curtains. When they called my name, I stepped into the spotlight. Grace smiled as she handed me the crystal award engraved simply with the words, "Courage through Creation." I thanked her, then turned toward the audience. Hundreds of faces looked up, a sea of strangers and friends. And then in the fourth row, I saw him. Ryan sat quietly among the crowd, his suit dark, his hands clasped. His expression was unreadable, but there was no bitterness, only a kind of quiet acceptance. He began to clap with everyone else, the sound blending into the applause. For a moment, the past and the present met in that sound. I met his gaze for one heartbeat, then looked toward the lights above. I spoke into the microphone. This award belongs to everyone who refused to disappear after being broken, to those who turned pain into purpose. We don't owe our strength to what hurt us, but to what we decided to build after. When I stepped off stage, Laura was waiting with tears in her eyes. She hugged me and said, "Closure looks good on you." The next morning, Daniel's article ran online with photos from the gala. The headline read, "A decade after loss, she turns survival into a movement." It detailed how the Marshall Foundation operated in 14 states, trained 60 instructors, and partnered with major hospitals. At the end, he quoted my speech and added one final line of his own. "Sometimes the brightest light comes from the quietest resilience." A week later, Chloe invited me to her studio to record a short reflection for the film's online release. I sat in front of a plain backdrop holding one of my old sketchbooks. She asked me what message I wanted people to take from all of this. I looked at her camera and said, "He left when I needed him most." But that moment taught me something no one else could. I never needed him at all. We were both silent for a while. Then she smiled through tears and said that was the ending she had been waiting for. That evening I went back to my art studio. The sun was dipping low, casting gold light through the window. The room smelled faintly of turpentine and lilies. On the easel stood the empty chair, its colors richer now after years of exhibitions. I had touched it up recently, adding a faint reflection of sky in the window pane, a small acknowledgement that time keeps offering new light. I picked up a brush and traced a thin line of white along the chair's edge, then set the brush down and stepped back. In the quiet, the sound of the city outside felt distant, like a song I no longer needed to sing. I spoke softly into the air, as if the walls themselves remembered everything that had happened here. He left when I needed him most. But maybe that was the gift. Because in that emptiness I met the strongest part of myself. The light shifted, catching the glass of the picture frame nearby. It looked almost like movement, a shimmer of something alive. I smiled, feeling no anger, no ache, just peace that stretched across every moment I had survived to reach. If someone were listening now, I would tell them this. If anyone has ever left you in the middle of your storm, don't waste your life trying to chase what already drowned. Live so fully that the pain loses its power. Let the quiet parts of your healing speak for you. Revenge isn't rage. It's peace that speaks louder. And sometimes that peace is proof enough.